The band hit their final cue. The crowd clapped on command. And Jimmy Kimmel walked out onto the stage like he had every night for years, with rhythm, with wit, and with just enough irony to suggest that none of this was meant to be taken too seriously. Except tonight it was. He delivered the monologue with ease. 2 jokes about Congress. 1 about gas prices. A quick laugh about billionaires in space. But there was something tighter in his shoulders. A pause between punchlines that didn't come from timing. It came from anticipation. Backstage, Pam Bondi waited. She wasn't here for a soundbite. She wasn't here for redemption. And she wasn't here for approval. She had accepted the invitation for one reason: to speak in a room that didn't think she belonged. The producer who met her at the dressing room door had done his best to sound casual. We're going to keep it open. A little politics. A little media. Just a conversation. Pam had nodded, but she wasn't fooled. It was never just a conversation. Not here. Not when the laughs were timed and the audience trained to cheer when prompted. Jimmy moved to the desk. The music faded. The lights softened. He looked into the camera and said, "My next guest is Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, legal analyst, and, depending on which network you watch, either a fearless voice for justice or a public relations disaster." The crowd laughed, but not fully. It was nervous laughter, the kind that arrives when people don't know what side they're supposed to be on. The band played her out. Pam stepped through the curtain. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She wore a black blazer. Nothing sparkly. Nothing soft. She crossed the stage, shook Jimmy's hand, and sat down. Jimmy leaned in. "I've got to say, brave of you to come here. You know this isn't exactly home turf." Pam said. "Neither was the courtroom. I still showed up." He grinned. A few in the audience chuckled. The sparring had started, but it hadn't landed. Yet, Jimmy began. "You've had a long career in law, in politics, and now in media. Do you think you're misunderstood? Or just misquoted?" Pam said, "I think people hear what makes them comfortable. And I don't speak to be comfortable." Jimmy countered. "Come on. You have to admit, some of what you've said and defended has caused some serious waves." Pam replied, "Waves aren't the problem. The problem is when rooms like this one decide waves are unacceptable if they don't match the current." The audience was quiet now. No cue light. No nervous laughter. Just attention. Jimmy asked, "So when you came here tonight, what were you hoping to do? Change minds?" Pam looked at him. "No. I came to speak without asking permission." That was the first moment the producers noticed the shift. A control room assistant leaned forward. "Is she walking us off the edge?" The lead producer said nothing, because something was happening that couldn't be directed. Jimmy leaned back slightly, adjusting his posture. "I mean, we've had a lot of guests from the other side of the aisle. But you're different. You come in with a defense like the verdict already landed." Pam said, "Because I've spent more time being judged by juries than by audiences." He looked down at his cards. Then off camera. He wasn't flustered, but he wasn't winning. Not in the way the show was built to win. He tried again. "You've been criticized for defending things people consider indefensible." Pam didn't flinch. So has every public defender in America. He tried to cut the tension with a smile. "But you weren't a public defender." "No," she said. "But I defended the right of people to speak before being simplified." There was no applause. There was no laugh. Just the sound of a room realizing it had stopped being entertainment. Jimmy checked his earpiece, then glanced at the stage manager. A signal was made. "Wrap it. Ease out." He turned back to Pam and said, "Well, that's all the time we have for this segment. Pam Bondi, everyone." A guest who clearly doesn't care about the applause meter. A few people clapped. A few didn't. Pam stood. She didn't shake his hand again. She walked off stage with the same posture she entered with, composed, clear, and unshaken. In the control booth, the assistant producer asked, "Are we airing that?" The showrunner said, "We have to." The director nodded. "But next time, maybe vet for tone." The segment aired exactly as it happened. No edit. No framing. Just the moment. And what people saw wasn't confrontation. It was refusal. Not to argue. Not to win. But to conform. Pam Bondi had sat in a room built for laughter. And didn't ask for a single one. The segment aired without warning. No teaser clip. No promotional tweet. No highlight reel with emojis and bold captions. Just a cold open into something the show couldn't quite explain. Pam Bondi seated across from Jimmy Kimmel. No laughter. No applause lines. No tension cut by charm. Just presence. And distance. The kind of distance that doesn't need volume to be felt. The audience watched. Some from curiosity. Some from habit. But when it ended, something unexpected happened. No one posted about the punchline. Because there wasn't one. A few people online tried to call it a takedown. Others called it a disaster. But most people weren't sure what to call it. Because it didn't fit. Not into categories. Not into clips. Not into the usual late-night rhythm of challenge and chuckle. In a group chat of television writers, someone asked, "What just happened?" A reply came back. She didn't get kicked off. She just walked out unbothered. Another message. She wasn't combative. She just wouldn't bend. In a quiet office in New York, a journalism professor played the segment for a media ethics class. He said, "Watch her posture, not her words." She didn't lean in. She didn't lean out. She stayed. One student said, "She didn't fight." Another said, "She didn't have to." Back in Los Angeles, Pam sat at a small cafe far from the studio. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't answer calls. Reed, her longtime aide, sat across from her, watching people across the street walk past without recognizing her. He said, "They're going to write whatever they want." Pam nodded. "I know." He added, "You could go on another show. Tell your side. Shape the takeaway." She looked at him calm. "I already did." He didn't respond. Because he understood. That moment on stage wasn't about debate. It was about drawing a line and refusing to flinch when no one crossed it. Later that day, Jimmy Kimmel walked into the writer's room. The staff was quieter than usual. No jokes on the whiteboard. No banter. Someone finally asked, "You okay?" Jimmy said, "I'm fine. I just underestimated how hard it is to joke with someone who doesn't come in needing to be liked." A writer said, "Do you think she came to win?" Jimmy shook his head. "She came to not lose herself." They paused. Then he said, "We didn't know how to hold that kind of silence." That line stayed in the room. It never made it to the press. Because no one outside the room would have known what it meant. The silence Pam carried into the studio wasn't passive. It was structured. A silence built from years in courtrooms. From holding posture while the room made assumptions. From waiting out noise. She hadn't refused Jimmy's questions. She'd refused the rhythm behind them. And the room hadn't known how to adjust. Back home, Pam received no fanfare. No viral moment. Just a letter in the mail from a former public defender in Minnesota. Typed on plain paper. It said, "I don't agree with you politically, but I watched. And I saw how you stayed calm while they waited for you to blink. You didn't. That was enough." Pam folded the letter. Didn't frame it. Didn't post it. Just kept it. Because it reminded her that sometimes the most unshakable message is the one you deliver without raising your voice. A week passed. The headlines moved on. Pam Bondi's name disappeared from the trending bar. But the clip didn't vanish. It resurfaced differently. Not in politics threads. Not in late-night reaction videos. It started appearing in quieter places. A graduate seminar on courtroom rhetoric played it during a class on nonverbal power. The professor paused halfway through and said, "Notice how little she moves." The students watched again. No raised eyebrows. No shifts in tone. No interruption. Just Pam, holding the table with her presence. One student said, "She wasn't avoiding the questions." Another said, "She was controlling the terms." And that's what stuck. Not the content. The composure. In a podcast on public discourse, a host referenced the interview without naming it. He said, "Sometimes, the most disruptive thing a guest can do is not flinch. Not retaliate. Just stay whole." Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, one of Jimmy's senior segment producers rewatched the show alone in the editing room. No plans to reuse the footage. Just curiosity. She paused at the part where Jimmy tried to shift tone, when the jokes no longer softened the moment. She watched Pam remain steady. Not cold. Just untouched. She said out loud to no one. She didn't shut it down. She just didn't lift it up. At a meeting the next day, she brought it up with the writing team. "I think we underestimated what it means when someone doesn't need the room." Jimmy nodded quietly. They didn't dwell on it. But they felt it. That not every guest arrives to fit the frame. Some arrived to expose it. Pam was back on the East Coast now. No press circuit. No statement. Just back to work. One night, at a law school panel in D.C., she was asked directly, "Was it a setup?" She smiled slightly. "No. It was a pattern. I just didn't match it." The moderator followed up. "Do you think it mattered?" Pam paused, then said, "It mattered to the people who watched without expecting to agree." A few heads nodded. The moderator added, "You weren't emotional." Pam replied, "Emotion isn't always the sharpest tool. Sometimes discipline is louder." That quote was scribbled into notebooks, but not tweeted, because the people who understood it didn't need it to trend. At her next public event, a man approached quietly. He looked down once before speaking. "I used to work in broadcast," he said. "When I saw what happened on that stage, I didn't see a loss. I saw a refusal to shrink." Pam said, "That's all it was." He shook her hand and walked away. Nothing more needed to be said, because something had been understood. In a world built on noise, she had delivered her position without needing to raise her voice. And that didn't make her invulnerable. It made her unforgettable. The moment didn't become legend. It became reference, not in headlines, but in how people started describing a different kind of presence. She held the space. She didn't rush the silence. She didn't answer with noise. Pam Bondi had done something most guests didn't do on television. She refused to offer what the room was built to provoke. Not resistance, not softness, not contradiction shaped into entertainment. She offered discipline, and the room didn't know what to do with that. In a conversation off-air, Jimmy told a friend in the industry, "I didn't lose the segment, but I didn't hold it either." The friend asked, "What did she do?" Jimmy said, "She showed up already finished." That description traveled quietly, not in gossip circles, but in media rooms where tone is everything. And some people started watching the interview again, not to analyze her politics, to study her restraint. At a journalism conference in Chicago, a keynote speaker played the segment on mute. The screen showed Pam seated, Jimmy reaching for levity, and the moment slipping from his hands. The speaker said, "You're watching what happens when someone walks in unshakable. No defense, no deflection, just calm, practiced refusal." In a policy office in D.C., a senior communications advisor sent the clip to her junior staff with one sentence. "This is how you hold line under pressure." One staffer replied, but she got cut short. The advisor replied, and she didn't need another second. Back home, Pam returned to her routines. She didn't bring up the segment again. She didn't frame it as a statement, but she noticed the difference in how certain rooms treated her now. Not with more agreement, but with more care. People didn't interrupt her as quickly, didn't assume she was there to argue. They listened longer, not because they had changed their minds, because they had seen her sit in a room that wasn't made for her and leave intact. At a private roundtable on law and media, a senior judge spoke about her quietly. He said, "There's a kind of clarity that comes from people who've stood in rooms where respect wasn't guaranteed." Another person at the table added, "She didn't perform credibility. She brought it with her." Pam didn't respond to that moment. She just listened, then changed the subject. Because for her, the lesson was never about being remembered. It was about being unshaken. And in a world chasing reaction, stillness had become a kind of quiet revolt. Months passed. The headlines turned over, again and again. Late-night shows returned to familiar rhythms. Guests came and went. Some tried to be funny. Some tried to be sharp. Most tried to be both. But the night Pam Bondi walked onto that stage and didn't bend to its rhythm, stayed with the people who knew how rare that was. In a podcast episode called The Interview That Didn't Perform, two former showrunners talked about it. One said, "She didn't come to change the room. She came not to be changed by it." The other added, "That kind of stillness, it doesn't play well, but it plays real." They didn't name her. They didn't need to. In a private email chain among political consultants, the segment was passed around again. This time not as content, but as instruction. A single line was highlighted in bold. She never tried to match the format. Back in Florida, Pam sat alone at a local event. No cameras, no podium, just a panel of citizens and a folding chair. During the Q&A, a high school student asked carefully, "Were you scared?" Pam looked at her directly. "No." The student waited. Pam continued. Because fear comes when you want something from the room. I didn't need anything. I just needed to stay honest. That line didn't trend, but it was remembered. Later that evening, a retired teacher approached her quietly in the parking lot. He said, I didn't agree with how you used to show up in the news. Still don't, most days. But I watched that interview. And for once, I saw someone sit in fire and not ask to be rescued. Pam nodded. That was the point. The man said, well, it worked. Then he got in his car and drove away. No photo, no signature, just memory. Somewhere in Los Angeles, a new writer for a late-night show kept a still image from the segment on her laptop. Pam, seated, calm, unmoved, not because she wanted to repeat it, but because she wanted to remember that some guests don't arrive to play. They arrive to be clear. At a legal conference in D.C., the segment was shown again, years later, not as a political moment, but a study in form. A constitutional litigator summed it up like this. She didn't get kicked off. She got finished before the room knew the conversation had already ended. Back in her home office, Pam kept no trophies from the moment. No printouts, no recordings, no saved tweets, just a thin folder labeled Kimmel. Inside it, a single sheet of paper, typed and signed. You didn't raise your voice, but you didn't lower yourself either. That's what people remember, even when they pretend they don't. She closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, because that was enough. She had walked into a room where approval was the currency, and left without spending a single cent of herself.